Sarah Martinez had always been different from other women in her small Texas town. At 28, she stood 5 feet 6 inches tall with calloused hands that spoke of years working her family's ranch. Her dark hair was usually tied back in a practical ponytail, and her brown eyes held a steely determination that had served her well through life's challenges. What made Sarah truly unique, however, was her exceptional skill with firearms. Growing up on the Martinez ranch, Sarah learned to shoot before she learned to drive. Her father, Miguel Martinez, was a former Marine who believed that every member of his family should know how to protect themselves and their property. The ranch sat on 300 acres of prime Texas land, isolated enough that help could be hours away if trouble came calling. Miguel had seen too much violence during his military service to leave his family defenseless. Sarah's relationship with her Winchester Model 70 rifle began when she turned 16. The rifle had been her grandfather's, passed down through 3 generations of Martinez men until it reached her. Miguel initially hesitated to give the precious weapon to his daughter, not because she was female, but because he knew the responsibility that came with it. However, Sarah had proven herself countless times at the local shooting range, consistently outperforming grown men with decades of experience. The rifle became an extension of Sarah herself. She could hit a target at 500 yards with breathtaking accuracy, a skill that impressed even the most skeptical ranchers in the area. Local law enforcement often called upon her expertise when dealing with dangerous wildlife that threatened livestock or posed risks to residents. Sarah had helped track down more than a dozen problem coyotes and 2 aggressive mountain lions over the years. On this particular morning, Sarah was preparing for what should have been a routine day. The autumn air was crisp, and she had planned to spend the morning checking fence lines on the northern section of their property. Recent reports of cattle thieves in the area had put all local ranchers on high alert. Just 3 weeks earlier, the Henderson Ranch had lost 12 head of cattle to rustlers who struck during the night. As Sarah loaded her rifle into her pickup truck, she noticed an unfamiliar sedan making its way up the long gravel driveway to their house. The car moved slowly, deliberately, sending up clouds of dust in its wake. Sarah's instincts immediately went on high alert. Unexpected visitors to their remote ranch were rare, and given the recent criminal activity in the area, any stranger warranted caution. 2 men emerged from the sedan, both wearing dark suits that seemed completely out of place in the rural setting. The driver was tall and thin with graying hair, while his passenger was shorter and stockier with a thick mustache. They approached the house with official bearing, their movements suggesting law enforcement or government backgrounds. The taller man introduced himself as Agent David Morrison from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. His partner was Agent Carl Hendricks. Morrison explained that they were conducting routine compliance checks on firearms registrations in the county. He spoke with practiced authority, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. Morrison's eyes quickly focused on the rifle visible in Sarah's truck. He asked to examine her firearms documentation, which Sarah provided without hesitation. Her grandfather's Winchester was properly registered, and all paperwork was current and in order. She had nothing to hide and had always been meticulous about following firearms laws. However, Agent Morrison claimed there was a discrepancy in the registration database. He stated that the serial number on Sarah's rifle matched one reported stolen from a gun store in Oklahoma 3 years earlier. Sarah knew this was impossible since her grandfather had owned the rifle for over 30 years, but Morrison was insistent. The situation escalated quickly when Morrison demanded that Sarah surrender the rifle immediately for federal investigation. Sarah calmly explained the weapon's history and offered to provide additional documentation proving her family's ownership. She had photographs of her grandfather with the rifle dating back decades, along with the original purchase receipt from 1967. Morrison refused to examine the additional evidence Sarah offered. Instead, he became increasingly aggressive, stating that federal law required immediate confiscation of any firearm with questionable registration status. His partner, Agent Hendricks, remained silent, but positioned himself strategically near Sarah's truck, blocking her access to the vehicle. Sarah felt a growing sense of unease about the entire situation. Something about these men didn't feel right. True federal agents would typically be more thorough in their investigation, more willing to examine evidence, and would usually arrive with local law enforcement support. These men seemed more interested in taking her rifle than in conducting a proper investigation. Despite her concerns, Sarah had no choice but to comply with what appeared to be a federal order. She carefully removed the rifle from her truck and handed it to Agent Morrison. As she did so, she noticed Hendricks speaking quietly into a radio, though she couldn't make out his words over the distance. Morrison examined the rifle briefly, running his hands over the well-maintained wood stock and checking the scope mounting. He made notes in a small notebook before placing the weapon in the trunk of their sedan. He promised Sarah that she would receive documentation about the confiscation and information about how to reclaim her property if the investigation cleared her ownership claim. As the two agents prepared to leave, Sarah asked for their business cards and contact information. Morrison handed her a generic card with federal contact numbers, but something about it looked off. The printing quality was poor, and the badge number seemed unusually short compared to other federal credentials she had seen. The sedan began pulling away from the ranch house, kicking up another cloud of dust. Sarah stood watching them go, her unease growing stronger with each passing second. Her instincts, honed by years of ranch life and countless encounters with both honest people and troublemakers, were screaming that something was very wrong. Within minutes of the sedan disappearing down the gravel road, Sarah's worst fears would be confirmed. The sound of gunshots would shatter the peaceful morning air, and the quiet ranch would become the scene of a desperate struggle for survival. That is, two men who had just taken her rifle were not federal agents at all, but something far more dangerous. Sarah's blood ran cold as the first gunshot echoed across the ranch. The sound came from the direction of the main road, where her elderly neighbors, the Washingtons, lived in a modest farmhouse about half a mile away. Frank and Betty Washington were both in their 70s and had been close family friends for over 2 decades. Frank's arthritis had worsened in recent years, making it difficult for him to maintain his property, so Sarah often helped with repairs and heavy lifting. The second shot came 30 seconds later, followed by a woman's scream that pierced the morning air. Sarah's military training kicked in immediately. Her father had not only taught her to shoot, but had also shared crucial combat wisdom from his time in Afghanistan. One of the most important lessons was to trust your instincts when something felt wrong, and every fiber of Sarah's being was now screaming danger. She sprinted toward her house, her boots pounding against the hard-packed dirt. Inside, Sarah rushed to her father's old gun safe, her fingers working the combination with practiced speed. Miguel kept several backup weapons in the house, including his service pistol from the Marines and a shotgun for home defense. Sarah grabbed the Glock 19 and checked the magazine. 15 rounds of 9mm ammunition. She also seized a box of extra rounds and stuffed them into her jacket pocket. As Sarah ran back outside, she could hear a vehicle approaching fast down the county road. Through the dust and heat shimmer, she could see it was the same dark sedan that had just left her property. But now it was speeding back toward her ranch, and she could see muzzle flashes coming from the passenger window. The horrible truth hit her like a physical blow. The men who had taken her rifle were not federal agents. They were killers, and they had just attacked the Washington farm. Worse yet, they were returning to eliminate the only witness who could identify them. Sarah realized with crystal clarity that she had been set up. The rifle confiscation had been a ruse to disarm her before they murdered everyone in the area. Sarah's mind raced as she calculated her options. The ranch house sat in a small valley with limited cover, making it a poor defensive position. The nearest real law enforcement was 30 miles away in the county seat, and cell phone coverage was spotty at best in this remote area. She was essentially on her own against 2 armed killers who now knew exactly where she lived. The sedan was now less than a quarter-mile away and closing fast. Sarah could see both men inside, and the passenger was definitely holding a weapon. She had perhaps 90 seconds before they reached her property. In that brief time, she needed to find cover, assess the threat, and prepare to defend herself against trained killers who had just murdered her neighbors. Sarah ran toward the large oak tree that stood between the house and the main road. The massive trunk was over 3 feet in diameter and would provide excellent cover from most angles. As she positioned herself behind the tree, She could hear the sedan's engine growing louder. The vehicle was moving fast, too fast for the rough gravel road, which told Sarah that the occupants were either panicking or extremely confident. Through a gap in the oak's branches, Sarah watched the sedan slide to a stop about 50 yards from her position. Dust billowed around the vehicle as both doors opened simultaneously. The two fake agents emerged with military precision, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Morrison carried what appeared to be a semi-automatic rifle, while Hendricks held a handgun. Now Sarah could see that these men were professionals. Their positioning, their communication through hand signals, and their tactical approach all suggested extensive training. They were not random criminals or opportunistic thieves. These were experienced killers, possibly mercenaries or former military personnel who had turned to murder for profit. Morrison began advancing toward the house while Hendricks moved to flank Sarah's position from the east. Their strategy was sound, designed to catch a panicked homeowner who might be hiding inside the building. Unfortunately for them, Sarah was neither panicked nor hiding in the house. She was a trained markswoman positioned behind solid cover with a clear field of fire. Sarah steadied her breathing and lined up her sights on Morrison, who was now about 40 yards away. At this range, with her pistol training and steady hands, she could place shots with deadly accuracy. However, she needed to be absolutely certain about her targets before taking any action. The last thing she wanted was to shoot innocent people, even if every instinct told her these men were killers. Her doubt was eliminated when Morrison raised his rifle and fired 3 quick shots into the ranch house windows. Glass exploded and wood splintered as the high-powered rounds tore through the building. There was no question now about their intentions. These men had come to kill her, just as they had apparently killed the Washingtons. Sarah took careful aim at Morrison's center mass. Her grandfather's lessons echoed in her mind. Never shoot to wound, never shoot to scare. If you draw your weapon, you shoot to stop the threat permanently. Her finger found the trigger and she began applying steady pressure. But before Sarah could fire, Hendricks spotted her position behind the oak tree. He shouted a warning to his partner and immediately began shooting in her direction. Bark exploded from the tree trunk as bullets struck the massive oak. Sarah pressed herself against the far side of the tree, temporarily protected, but now pinned down by accurate fire. Morrison immediately adjusted his position, moving to gain a better angle on Sarah's hiding spot. Within seconds, she would be caught in a crossfire between 2 experienced killers. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Sarah knew she had only moments to act before being overwhelmed. She could hear Hendricks reloading his weapon, which gave her a brief window of opportunity. Sarah quickly moved around the tree trunk, exposing herself just long enough to acquire Morrison as a target. The tall fake agent was now less than 30 yards away, his rifle raised and aimed directly at her position. Time seemed to slow as Sarah brought her pistol up to firing position. Morrison's finger was already on his trigger, and she could see the muzzle of his rifle beginning to swing toward her. In that split second, Sarah faced the grim reality that one of them was about to die, and her survival depended entirely on who could shoot first and most accurately. Sarah's first shot caught Morrison's center mass just as he was bringing his rifle to bear on her position. The 9mm bullet struck him in the chest, spinning him sideways and causing his rifle to discharge harmlessly into the ground. Morrison stumbled backward, his face showing shock and disbelief that his carefully planned ambush had gone wrong so quickly. But Sarah's military training had taught her never to assume a single shot would stop a determined attacker. As Morrison fell, she was already adjusting her aim for a follow-up shot. The wounded man was still moving, still potentially dangerous, and she could hear Hendricks shouting commands from somewhere to her east. Morrison hit the ground hard, but was far from finished. Despite his chest wound, he rolled behind his partner's abandoned sedan, using the vehicle for cover while he assessed his injuries. Blood was spreading across his white shirt, but the wound appeared to be through muscle and tissue rather than vital organs. He was hurt, but still combat effective. Sarah knew she had perhaps 5 seconds before Hendricks resumed his flanking maneuver. She used that precious time to change her position, moving from behind the oak tree to a large boulder about 20 feet to the north. The new position gave her better angles on both attackers while maintaining solid cover from return fire. As she settled behind the granite boulder, Sarah could hear Morrison calling out to his partner. His voice was strained with pain but still strong enough to coordinate their continued attack. These men were not giving up despite the unexpected resistance they had encountered. Hendricks responded to his partner's call by unleashing a barrage of gunfire in Sarah's general direction. Bullets sparked off the boulder and whined through the air around her position. The volume of fire told Sarah that Hendricks had switched to a weapon with a larger magazine capacity, probably a semi-automatic rifle similar to what Morrison had been carrying. During the brief lull as Hendricks reloaded, Sarah heard Morrison moving behind the sedan. She could tell from the sounds that he was trying to work his way around the vehicle to get a better shooting angle. Despite his wound, the man was still functioning as a trained combatant, which confirmed Sarah's growing suspicion that these were not ordinary criminals. Sarah decided to press her advantage while Morrison was still wounded, and before the two killers could reorganize their attack. She rose slightly from behind the boulder and fired 2 quick shots at the sedan's rear window, hoping to keep Morrison pinned down. The safety glass spider webbed but held, though her shots clearly had the desired effect of preventing Morrison from advancing. Hendricks immediately returned fire, forcing Sarah back behind her rocky cover. But in that brief exchange, she had gotten a clear look at his position. He was now crouched behind a small drainage ditch about 60 yards away, partially concealed by tall grass, but not completely hidden. The tactical situation had stabilized into a deadly stalemate. Both sides had cover and clear fields of fire, but neither could advance without exposing themselves to accurate shooting. Sarah had the advantage of knowing the terrain intimately, but her opponents had superior firepower and training. Most importantly, she was vastly outnumbered. Sarah checked her ammunition situation. She had fired 3 rounds, leaving 12 in her pistol's magazine plus the box of ammunition in her jacket pocket. Against 2 determined killers with rifles, she needed to make every shot count. Wasting ammunition on suppressive fire would only hasten her defeat. Morrison's voice carried across the battlefield as he tried to coordinate with his partner. Sarah could hear enough of their conversation to understand that they were planning another flanking maneuver. One would provide covering fire while the other advanced to a new position. It was a sound tactical approach that had probably worked for them many times before. But Sarah had advantages that her attackers didn't fully appreciate. She knew every inch of this ranch, including features that weren't visible from their current positions. About 30 yards behind Hendricks' position, hidden by the tall grass, was an old irrigation channel that ran perpendicular to his line of sight. If Sarah could reach that channel without being seen, she could approach his position from an unexpected angle. The plan was risky, requiring her to leave her current cover and cross open ground while under potential observation from 2 armed men. However, staying in her current position would eventually lead to defeat as the killers coordinated their attacks and gradually closed the distance between them. Sarah waited for the next exchange of gunfire to begin her move. When Morrison fired several shots from behind the sedan, drawing Hendricks's attention and return fire, she sprinted from behind the boulder toward a small shed about 40 feet away. The building would provide temporary cover while she assessed the next phase of her movement. Bullets whined past her as she ran, but neither attacker had been prepared for her sudden movement. Sarah dove behind the shed just as several rounds splintered the wood above her head. Her heart was pounding, but she had successfully changed her position without being hit. From behind the shed, Sarah had a different angle on both attackers. She could see Morrison more clearly now, and she was disturbed to realize that his chest wound wasn't slowing him down as much as she had hoped. The man was still moving with purpose and seemed to be preparing for another assault on her position. More troubling was the sight of additional weapons in the sedan. Through the broken rear window, Sarah could see what appeared to be several long guns and boxes of ammunition. These killers had come prepared for a prolonged battle, which suggested they had planned this attack carefully and thoroughly. Sarah also noticed something that chilled her blood. Morrison was speaking into a radio or cell phone, apparently communicating with someone outside the immediate area. The possibility that these 2 killers had backup support or that more attackers were on their way filled Sarah with new urgency. She needed to end this fight quickly, before reinforcements could arrive, or before the killers could fully coordinate their attacks. The irrigation channel was still her best option for gaining a tactical advantage, but reaching it would require perfect timing and a considerable amount of luck. As Sarah prepared for the next phase of her desperate battle, she thought briefly about her neighbors, the Washingtons. If these killers had indeed murdered the elderly couple, then Sarah was not just fighting for her own survival. She was fighting to ensure that Frank and Betty's killers faced justice, and that no other innocent people in the area would fall victim to these predators. Sarah's opportunity came when Morrison made a critical tactical error. Overconfident despite his wound, he decided to advance on her position, while Hendricks provided covering fire. The wounded killer moved from behind the sedan toward a pile of fence posts that would bring him within 30 yards of Sarah's current hiding spot behind the shed. What Morrison couldn't see from his angle was that Sarah had already begun moving again. Using the covering fire that Hendricks was laying down, she had slipped away from the shed and was now crawling through the tall grass toward the irrigation channel she had identified earlier. The same gunfire that was meant to pin her down was actually masking the sounds of her movement. Sarah reached the edge of the irrigation channel just as Morrison arrived at his new position behind the fence posts. From her concealed location in the channel, she now had a clear view of Hendricks, who was still focused on the shed where he believed she was hiding. The stocky killer was partially exposed, concentrating on providing accurate fire support for his wounded partner. The irrigation channel was about 4 feet deep and lined with concrete, providing excellent concealment and protection. Sarah could move along its length without being detected, potentially getting within effective pistol range of either attacker. More importantly, she could observe both killers without being seen, giving her crucial information about their positions and intentions. From her new vantage point, Sarah watched Morrison signal to his partner that he was ready for the next phase of their attack. Hendricks acknowledged with a hand gesture and immediately intensified his fire on the shed. Sarah realized they were preparing for Morrison to assault her last known position, while she was supposedly pinned down by rifle fire. Sarah made a quick decision that would determine the outcome of the entire battle. Instead of engaging Hendricks, who was farther away and had better cover, she would wait for Morrison to advance and then take him at close range when he discovered she was no longer behind the shed. It was a calculated risk that required perfect timing and nerves of steel. Morrison began his final approach, moving in short rushes from one piece of cover to the next. Sarah could see that despite his chest wound, he was still moving with military precision, keeping his weapon ready and his head on a swivel for any sign of movement. This man was definitely not an amateur criminal. As Morrison closed the distance to the shed, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. The wounded killer was carrying what appeared to be a fragmentation grenade on his tactical vest. If he reached the shed and realized she wasn't there, he might use the explosive device to flush her out of the area, potentially killing her even if she was well hidden. When Morrison reached the corner of the shed, he paused to coordinate with Hendricks one final time. Sarah could hear him counting down over the radio, preparing for what was obviously a well-rehearsed assault technique. She realized that these men had done this before, probably many times, and they were executing their attack with deadly professionalism. Morrison rounded the corner of the shed with his rifle raised, ready to kill anyone he found hiding there. His surprise at finding the area empty lasted only a split second before his combat training kicked in. Instead of standing in the open looking confused, he immediately began scanning for alternative hiding spots where his target might have moved. Sarah was already moving when Morrison began his search. She had crawled to within 20 feet of his position, and now rose from the irrigation channel with her pistol aimed at his center mass. Morrison spotted her movement and began to swing his rifle toward her. But Sarah had achieved complete tactical surprise. Her first shot struck Morrison in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to drop his rifle. Her second shot, fired less than a second later, caught him center mass and dropped him to the ground. Morrison tried to reach for the grenade on his vest, but Sarah's third shot ended his threat permanently. Hendricks heard the gunfire and immediately realized that his partner was down. His response was swift and violent, sending a continuous stream of rifle fire toward Sarah's position. Bullets struck the concrete sides of the irrigation channel, sending chips of stone flying through the air around her. Sarah pressed herself against the bottom of the channel as bullets whined overhead. She had eliminated one threat, but Hendricks was now aware of her true position and was bringing concentrated fire to bear on her location. The concrete channel provided good protection from direct fire, but Hendricks might have grenades or other explosive devices that could neutralize her cover. During a brief pause in the gunfire, Sarah heard Hendricks speaking rapidly into his radio. She couldn't make out all the words, but she caught enough to understand that he was calling for immediate backup. The surviving killer was reporting that his partner was down and that he was facing unexpectedly strong resistance from a single defender. Sarah realized that her tactical situation was about to become much worse. If Hendricks had backup coming, she needed to eliminate him before reinforcements arrived. Fighting one skilled killer was challenging enough, but facing multiple attackers would be nearly impossible, given her limited ammunition and isolated position. She began moving along the irrigation channel toward Hendricks's position, staying low to avoid being seen. The concrete channel extended to within about 40 yards of where the killer was positioned, but the final approach would require crossing open ground under fire. As Sarah moved through the channel, she discovered something that significantly improved her tactical situation. About halfway to Hendricks's position, a large drainage pipe intersected the irrigation channel. The pipe was just large enough for her to crawl through, and it appeared to extend toward the area where Hendricks was positioned. Sarah entered the drainage pipe and began crawling through the darkness toward what she hoped would be a position behind or beside the remaining killer. The pipe was cramped and uncomfortable, but it offered complete concealment from enemy observation. More importantly, it might allow her to approach Hendricks from an unexpected angle. The pipe extended for about 50 feet before ending at another drainage outlet. When Sarah reached the end and cautiously looked out, she found herself in an ideal position. Hendricks was only 25 feet away, and he was completely focused on watching the irrigation channel where he believed Sarah was still hiding. Sarah could see that Hendricks was indeed carrying additional weapons and equipment. He had at least 2 rifles, multiple magazines of ammunition, and what appeared to be several explosive devices. This man had come prepared for war, not just a simple murder. As Sarah prepared to engage the final attacker, she could hear the distant sound of approaching vehicles. Hendricks's backup was arriving, and she had only minutes before the tactical situation became hopeless. She needed to end this fight immediately, before facing multiple enemies with superior firepower and positioning. Sarah emerged from the drainage pipe with deadly silent precision, her pistol already aimed at Hendricks's exposed profile. The stocky killer was so focused on watching the irrigation channel that he never sensed her approach from his blind side. At this range, with her years of marksmanship training, Sarah knew she couldn't miss. Her first shot took Hendricks in the head, dropping him instantly. The killer fell forward over his rifle, his finger reflexively pulling the trigger and sending a final burst of gunfire into the ground. Sarah immediately moved to secure his weapons, knowing that backup was approaching and she would need every advantage available. Hendricks had been carrying an impressive arsenal. 2 AR-15 style rifles, over 400 rounds of ammunition, 6 fragmentation grenades, and what appeared to be military-grade communications equipment. Sarah quickly appropriated one of the rifles and several magazines, dramatically improving her firepower for the coming battle. The sound of approaching vehicles was getting louder, and Sarah could now distinguish at least 2 separate engines. She estimated the reinforcements would reach her ranch in less than 3 minutes, giving her precious little time to prepare defensive positions for what was shaping up to be a major firefight. Sarah dragged Hendricks's body and weapons to a better defensive position behind a large water trough near the main barn. The metal container was filled with water and would provide excellent protection against small arms fire. More importantly, it gave her clear fields of fire toward both the main road and the secondary access route that led to her property. As she settled into her new position, Sarah conducted a quick inventory of her resources. She now had 2 rifles, with approximately 300 rounds of ammunition, her pistol with 8 remaining rounds, and 6 grenades that she hoped she wouldn't need to use. Against an unknown number of attackers, it might be enough to hold them off until real law enforcement could arrive. The first reinforcement vehicle came into view as a black SUV moving fast down the gravel road. Sarah could see at least 2 occupants, and the vehicle's windows were tinted too darkly to determine if there were additional passengers. The SUV was followed closely by a second identical vehicle, suggesting a well-organized criminal operation with substantial resources. Both SUVs slowed as they approached the area where Morrison and Hendricks had been operating. Sarah watched through her rifle scope as armed men emerged from the vehicles, obviously trained professionals who immediately began assessing the tactical situation. She counted 6 additional attackers, all carrying military-style weapons and moving with coordinated precision. The leader of the reinforcement team was a tall man with gray hair who immediately took charge of the situation. Sarah watched him examine Morrison's body and then coordinate his team's deployment with hand signals. These were not random criminals or local gang members. They moved like military special forces or experienced mercenaries. Sarah realized she was facing a sophisticated criminal organization that had planned this operation extensively. The initial attack on her ranch had been intended as a simple elimination of witnesses, but it had escalated into a major battle that was drawing additional resources. Someone had invested serious money and manpower in this operation. The gray-haired leader split his team into 2 groups. 3 men would approach Sarah's position from the east while the other 3 moved to flank her from the west. It was a classic military tactic designed to divide her attention and create multiple threats that she couldn't address simultaneously. Sarah knew she was severely outmanned, but she had several advantages that her attackers might not fully appreciate. She knew every inch of the ranch terrain. She had superior defensive positions and, most importantly, she was fighting for her life on her own property. Sometimes that psychological advantage could make the difference in an otherwise hopeless situation. The Eastern team began their approach first, using a dry creek bed for concealment as they advanced toward Sarah's position. She allowed them to close to within 100 yards before engaging, wanting to ensure maximum effectiveness from her limited ammunition. Her first shots caught the lead attacker completely by surprise, dropping him before he could find cover. The remaining 2 members of the Eastern team immediately went to ground and began returning fire. Their muzzle flashes gave Sarah clear targets, and she systematically engaged each position with careful, aimed shots. Her second target was eliminated quickly, but the third man was more experienced and found excellent cover behind a concrete culvert. While Sarah was engaged with the Eastern team, the Western group had advanced much closer to her position. They were now within 50 yards and beginning to coordinate their own assault. Sarah realized she would soon be caught in a crossfire between multiple attackers, a tactical situation that would be almost impossible to survive. The gray-haired leader had remained near the SUVs, coordinating the attack through radio communications. Sarah could see him speaking into a handheld device, probably directing the movement of his remaining men. She made a command decision that would determine the outcome of the entire battle. Using one of Hendricks's grenades, Sarah created a diversion that drew the attention of the Western team. The explosion provided enough distraction for her to change positions, moving from behind the water trough to inside the main barn. The building provided better cover and multiple firing positions, but it also limited her escape routes if the situation became untenable. From inside the barn, Sarah could engage targets from several different windows and doorways. The attackers would have difficulty determining her exact position, giving her a significant tactical advantage. More importantly, the barn contained additional supplies that might prove useful, including tools that could be improvised as weapons, if necessary. Sarah heard the leader calling for a coordinated assault on the barn. All remaining attackers would advance simultaneously from multiple directions, overwhelming her ability to defend all approaches. It was a sound tactical decision that would probably succeed if executed properly. As the attackers began their final assault, Sarah prepared for what might be her last stand. She had fought bravely and eliminated 4 professional killers, but the odds against her were becoming overwhelming. However, she was determined to make her final shots count, ensuring that these murderers would pay the highest possible price for their crimes. The sound of sirens in the distance gave Sarah a sudden surge of hope. Someone had apparently called law enforcement, and help was finally approaching. She just needed to survive a few more minutes until real police officers could arrive, and even the odds in this deadly confrontation. The approaching sirens had an immediate effect on the remaining attackers. Sarah could hear the gray-haired leader barking urgent commands into his radio, clearly trying to coordinate a rapid withdrawal before law enforcement arrived. The professional, criminals had no intention of engaging in a firefight with police officers, preferring to eliminate their witness and escape before facing official resistance. But Sarah wasn't going to make their escape easy. As the surviving attackers began, falling back toward their vehicles, she emerged from the barn and engaged them with accurate rifle fire. Her shots forced the retreating criminals to take cover, buying precious time for the approaching police officers to get closer. The leader made a critical error in his haste to escape. Instead of coordinating an orderly withdrawal under covering fire, he ordered his men to make a run for the SUVs. This gave Sarah clear targets as the attackers abandoned their covered positions and sprinted across open ground. Sarah's marksmanship training served her well in those crucial moments. Her first shot dropped the man who had been hiding behind the concrete culvert. Her second shot wounded another attacker who stumbled and fell halfway to the vehicles. The remaining criminals reached their SUVs, but they were clearly shaken by the effectiveness of Sarah's defensive fire. The lead SUV started immediately, but the second vehicle had sustained damage from Sarah's gunfire and was slow to respond. She could see the driver frantically trying to start the engine, while his passengers provided covering fire from the vehicle's windows. Sarah's concentrated fire on the disabled SUV prevented it from joining the escape attempt. Sheriff's deputies arrived just as the first SUV was attempting to flee down the gravel road. The timing couldn't have been better, as the police vehicles were perfectly positioned to intercept the escaping criminals. Sarah watched with satisfaction as the black SUV was forced off the road by a deputy's patrol car. The second SUV was still disabled near Sarah's property, and its occupants were now trapped between her position and the approaching law enforcement officers. After a brief exchange of gunfire with the deputies, the surviving criminals in the disabled vehicle surrendered rather than face certain death in a hopeless battle. Within minutes, Sarah's ranch was swarming with sheriff's deputies, state police officers, and federal agents. The scope and sophistication of the attack had triggered responses from multiple law enforcement agencies, all eager to understand how a simple rural property had become the scene of such an extensive gun battle. Sheriff Tom Bradley, who had known Sarah's family for over 20 years, was among the first officials to reach her position. Bradley had served in Iraq alongside Sarah's father, and understood immediately that Sarah had faced trained killers, not ordinary criminals. The evidence scattered across the ranch told a story of professional military tactics being used against a single defender. As paramedics checked Sarah for injuries, she provided a detailed account of the morning's events to the assembled law enforcement officers. Her description of the fake federal agents immediately raised red flags with the FBI agents who had arrived on scene. The use of false federal credentials suggested an organized criminal enterprise with significant resources and planning capabilities. The investigation of the crime scene revealed the true scope of the conspiracy Sarah had unknowingly disrupted. The weapons recovered from the attackers were high-end military surplus, including several that were traced to recent thefts from National Guard armories. The communications equipment found on the bodies was sophisticated enough to coordinate operations across multiple states. Most shocking was the discovery made when officers searched the attackers' vehicles. Hidden in the first SUV was a detailed list of over 30 names and addresses, all corresponding to rural property owners. In Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico, Sarah's name was near the top of the list, but the Washingtons were also included, along with dozens of other ranchers and farmers who lived in isolated areas. Detective Maria Santos from the state police took charge of processing the evidence and coordinating with federal agencies. Santos had worked organized crime cases for over 15 years and recognized the hallmarks of a sophisticated criminal operation. The level of planning, equipment, and coordination suggested ties to international crime syndicates or possibly domestic terrorist organizations. The breakthrough in understanding the conspiracy came when investigators searched the phones and documents found on the dead attackers. Text messages and emails revealed a complex scheme targeting rural property owners who possessed valuable land, livestock, or other assets. The criminal organization would research their targets extensively, then eliminate entire families to steal their property and resources. Sarah learned that the Washingtons had indeed been murdered, just as she had feared when she heard the gunshots. Frank and Betty had been killed in their home during what appeared to be a robbery, but investigators now understood it was part of the larger conspiracy to eliminate witnesses and steal valuable ranch property. The elderly couple had been targeted because their land bordered a major interstate highway, making it valuable for development. The fake federal agents had been sent to disarm Sarah before killing her, recognizing that her marksmanship skills and military training made her a significant threat to their operation. By confiscating her rifle under the pretense of a federal investigation, they had hoped to leave her defenseless when they returned to complete their mission. FBI agent Rebecca Chen, who specialized in organized crime investigations, explained to Sarah that she had single-handedly disrupted a criminal enterprise that had been operating across multiple states for over 2 years. The organization was believed responsible for at least 15 murders and the theft of property worth millions of dollars. The surviving attackers provided crucial information when faced with federal conspiracy and murder charges. Their leader, identified as Marcus Webb, was a former Army Special Forces operator who had been dishonorably discharged for criminal activity. Webb had recruited other military veterans and organized them into a highly effective criminal organization that specialized in targeting isolated rural properties. Sarah's heroic defense of her ranch had not only saved her own life, but it also prevented the murders of countless other innocent people whose names appeared on the target list. Law enforcement agencies across the Southwest immediately began providing protection for the other intended victims, while investigators worked to identify additional members of the criminal organization. The investigation revealed that the conspiracy extended far beyond the immediate attackers Sarah had faced. Webb's organization had connections to corrupt officials in several counties who provided inside information about valuable properties and their owners. Several local officials were arrested as the investigation expanded, including a county assessor, who had been providing detailed property information to the criminals. Sarah's actions that morning made national headlines as details of the conspiracy emerged. Media outlets praised her courage and marksmanship skills, but Sarah herself remained focused on grieving for her murdered neighbors and helping law enforcement build cases against the surviving criminals. The recovered Winchester rifle that had been confiscated from Sarah was returned to her, along with official apologies from federal agencies. The weapon became a symbol of her remarkable survival story, though Sarah quietly returned it to her gun safe, hoping never to need such skills again. In the months that followed, Sarah worked closely with victim advocacy groups to help other families who had been targeted by the criminal organization. Her experience and survival skills made her a valuable resource for people trying to understand and cope with similar threats to their safety and property. The final tally from that morning's battle was sobering. 4 professional killers dead, 2 captured, and a multi-state criminal conspiracy completely disrupted. Sarah had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious through a combination of skill, courage, and determination that saved not only her own life, but the lives of countless other innocent people. Years later, Sarah still lived on the family ranch, though she had upgraded her security systems and maintained closer contact with law enforcement agencies. The peaceful rural lifestyle she had always cherished had been forever changed by that terrible morning, but her actions had ensured that justice was served and that other families would be spared the violence she had faced. The case became a landmark example of how individual courage and preparedness could triumph over organized criminal violence. Sarah's story was studied in law enforcement academies and military training programs as an example of effective defensive tactics against multiple attackers. Her name became synonymous with the principle that evil succeeds only when good people are unable or unwilling to resist. The Martinez Ranch remained in the family, a testament to Sarah's refusal to be driven from her ancestral home by criminals and killers. The bullet holes in the barn were repaired, but Sarah kept one as a reminder of the day she stood alone against overwhelming odds and emerged victorious through courage, skill, and an unwavering commitment to justice.